Welcome to another episode of Miami Cop Talk. Visit us at MiamiCopTalk.com. With us is Robert Asencio and Raul Correa discussing the latest issues in public safety, law enforcement, what's in the news with invited guests. And again, visit us, help us grow our audience. We are one community, one voice. And let's get ready to start another episode of Miami Cop Talk. Here we are, another episode of Miami Cop Talk. I'm Raul, and with me is my co-host and partner, Robert Asencio.
Absolutely. So I have the pleasure of introducing Tom Tundidor. He's a detective with Miami-Dade County Police Department, one of the proudest, one of the finest agencies in our country, as we know. But very important is everybody's heard of human trafficking. We like to explore and give us a definition of what human trafficking is and what the status of human trafficking is in South Florida. Tom, welcome.
Honored to be here. And I'd like to say that it's very prevalent in South Florida, especially where I worked. And it's a very important topic.
You know, we hear human trafficking. And, basically, and correct me if I'm wrong, I know that, force, fraud, and coercion are the three elements to human trafficking. That sounds a lot like human prostitution in some way, shape, or form. Can you correct us? I know some people say, "Hey, is human trafficking just a new term for prostitution?" And
No.
Tell us a little bit about that, because I tell people, no, it doesn't have to involve sex. It could be slave labor. If you got that lady in your house locked up in the closet, cooking and cleaning. That's human trafficking.
The biggest misnomer, yes, force, fraud, and coercion are necessary for an adult to be human trafficked, but for a child, all you need is a commercial sex act. You do not need force, fraud, or coercion.
Wow.
The other issue is, like you said, yes, there's labor trafficking, which is part of human trafficking, and there's sex trafficking, but prostitution and human trafficking are two totally different things. So human trafficking is the manufacturing of using a person in order for financial gain, where prostitution, when it's being done and not forced, is done voluntarily. So it's two completely different things.
So in South Florida, would you say the bigger problem is the sex trade or the abuse of people, like you said, labor force, right?
I have to be honest with you. While we don't get as many labor trafficking cases, that doesn't mean that they're not there. We've recently seen a spike in labor trafficking cases. I was just speaking with the sergeant of the Human Trafficking Unit, Sergeant David Quintas, the other day, and they've had a handful of labor trafficking cases this year alone. So that just because they're not reported doesn't mean that they're not there. And those cases in general are very underreported. Even the sex trafficking ones, it's very difficult for people to realize that they're being victimized, and they don't often think of themselves as victims, and they don't self-identify. And that holds true with labor as well. It's very hard to get those victims to come forward and identify as victims.
So human trafficking basically is the umbrella where you have a whole series of industries that are profiting off of, for lack of a better term, slave labor.
Correct.
And prostitution being one of them. Let me ask you a question, because I know it's on the news all over the news. The border crisis down in the South End. They say this year, 2021, there's been close to 2 million people crossing the border illegally. That must be ripe picking for those individuals involved in human trafficking.
Well, yes, but let's not confuse the two. Remember that the border crisis and people crossing the border are doing that voluntarily, and that is human smuggling versus human trafficking. Now, oftentimes a human smuggling case can become a trafficking case because of debt bondage. But at the very beginning stages, when those people are crossing the border and when they pay to cross the border, that is a smuggling case versus a trafficking case. And a lot of people confuse the two.
Okay.
But the easiest way to define it, a lot of people see the word trafficking and they think there has to be movement for that crime to occur, and there does not have to be movement. So trafficking, that word really is disingenuous as far as this crime goes, because you really don't have to have movement to have trafficking.
Let's go into a little bit about your background, because I think your background is a notable background. It's certainly a very accomplished background. But so how many years did you spend with Miami-Dade County? What are you doing now? When did you retire? And how are you still engaged in this important discussion and this never-ending abuse of people?
So I was with Miami-Dade County for 30 years. I served in the community as a police officer for 30 years, from November of 2019. I'm sorry, from November of 1989 to November of 2019. I retired in 2019. Since 2017, I've been a contracted instructor for several for-profit and nonprofit organizations that I teach for, and I travel around the country and teach a human trafficking investigations class. I was also part of several task forces. When I was working for the county, I was part of the state attorney's task force against human trafficking. I was also part of the South Florida Human Trafficking Task Force, and I was also a TFO for the FBI in their Crimes Against Children task force. I currently am still a member of the South Florida Human Trafficking Task Force, and I serve on the Outreach and Training Committee, which we just did a outreach on Friday down at the South Dade Labor Camp in Southwest Miami-Dade County.
Not to get into any gory details or to give out names or anything like that, can you share with us maybe one of the cases you worked on that involved children in our community? Or it doesn't have to be children, but any case that involved the local South Florida community?
Yeah, sure. Back in 2012, we were involved in a case that involved not only children, but foster children in our community. And they were being basically plucked out of foster homes in South Miami-Dade County and North Miami-Dade County as well. And they were being exploited and pimped out by several individuals. And we actually worked that case for quite a while, developed 6 or 7 victims, and basically arrested 2 individuals that were subsequently, they took pleas. I think one of them took a plea to 12 or 13 years, and the other one took a plea to a little bit less than that. They actually ended up being brothers. The school system, a lot of times the school police and the school administrators are at the forefront of this battle with human trafficking, because they have to recognize and see the signs and report it to investigators so that we can come forward and bring these cases forward. So a lot of these cases, hopefully the red flags are being seen by school administrators and school board police and being picked up on.
Yeah, Tom, so I'm going to take a point of privilege here, and I've done this with other guests because I think it's the appropriate setting to do it, since I wasn't able to say this many years ago. For all the times that you came out or your detectives came out to help, not just me, but my units, I can't thank you enough. Immense gratitude for what it is that you do. I know it's got to be extremely difficult on you, your loved ones, but more importantly, thank you for continuing the fight, brother. You really, I can't thank you enough.
You're welcome.
Tom, real quick, I'd like to circle the wagon and really address a very important issue here. When I was in the legislature after I left police work, I sought to pass legislation on to further educate the public as far as what to look out for, what not to look out for in this arena. Can you provide some pointers as to what to look out for, and also a point of reference for help, anybody that needs help that might be viewing this?
Sure. It's funny that you mentioned that, because on Friday at the outreach, one of our service providers asked me what I thought were the biggest challenges to this fight. And I think one of the biggest challenges is awareness. And one of the biggest challenges is the fact that people, for the most part, don't recognize it. And for the most part, people don't see what they're not looking for. And if they're not looking for it and they don't see those signs and they don't see these things, then it goes unnoticed. I think it's more prevalent than what people believe. And I only know that because before I started working these cases in 2007, I didn't realize how prevalent it was. But so some of the signs could be a young child or a younger girl with an older individual, tattoos or brandings, somebody that looks like they're being controlled, somebody that isn't able to respond for themselves. There's always another individual that's responding for them. Those are some of the signs that we look for. Another thing where you're going to see this a lot, and you're going to see this in the area of commerce, you're going to see this at hotels and motels. When you're checking into hotels and motels, be very cognizant of the people that you see checking in. And a lot of times these individuals will be checking in with a child that is obviously not their child, doesn't look anything like them, does not correlate to them. So you have to look for those signs. You're going to see that, like I said, hotels, motels. And also the other thing that I wanted to put out there to people is it's not what is portrayed in the movies. It's not usually the way it's showed in Taken and in those movies. It's usually these victims are recruited by somebody that they know, by a family member, a friend, and they're recruited into this by somebody that they know. So it's not like there's a white van driving around abducting these people and putting them into this life. They're usually recruited, and it's usually more manipulation than anything else. And if I can give you a couple of numbers for people to report this to. The local number for the state attorney's tip line is 305 fix stop, and the national hotline is Polaris. The national Polaris hotline is 1-888-373-7888.
Tom, let me ask you a question. NCMEC, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, that's big. We have roughly reported a little over 400,000, 460,000, I guess the last numbers I looked at. But reported and non-reported, we're in like 1.6, 1.3 million children that are missing in the reported, non-reported category. But on the NCMEC roster, there's a little over 460,000. Now we know the great majority of kids that are reported missing are recovered, but there is that 2 to 3%, which is a huge number. One is too many. But can you basically, and I know some of it is tied into human trafficking, not all of it, thank God, but custodial kidnappings or whatnot. But can you connect those two entities there, the NCMEC and human trafficking? How can we as the general bystanders be more aware of what's going on in our society?
So NCMEC is a great resource. I actually went up and took their training in Alexandria, Virginia. They offer great training for law enforcement. They also, in support and means of support, they also offer analysts and a lot of resources. They also put out flyers for law enforcement on missing children. And I think to answer your question, I think that we just need to be more aware, and we need to notice these signs, like I said, and just be more aware. It's probably happening more than you could even imagine in regular neighborhoods, and people have this false fiction, these myths that it's only in low-income neighborhoods, that it's only affects low-income families, and that's absolutely not true. I can tell you that I've worked cases in all demographics, in low-income neighborhoods. I've worked cases of affluent kids that were being exploited. So it doesn't discriminate. It's not just affecting low-income neighborhoods. As far as the number of missing children, I don't know. I mean, I know that that's one of our red flags is runaways, and I know that when you have runaways, usually the number that we look at is within the first 48 hours of a runaway being gone is when they're going to be lured into trafficking. Now, sometimes they run away because somebody has already recruited them into trafficking, and so they run away in order to be able to do these activities. So runaways is definitely a red flag for us in law enforcement, as far as, and so is truancies. Truancies are also a red flag. There's a lot of red flags out there. But I will tell you that, and I talked about this today in the class that I taught earlier. Those red flags doesn't necessarily mean that it's definitely trafficking. Those are just signs that we use in order to be able to identify it. So hopefully that answered your question. Did I answer your question about necklace?
Yeah, absolutely. Those red flags. You just, I always told people, well, I don't know if I should call the police. I don't know if I go, listen, when in doubt, let somebody else figure it out. Pick up the phone and call law enforcement, and we can come in, or law enforcement can come in and take a look at what's going on. I know when Robert was with the state legislature, he came in and spoke at a conference that I was working at, and this lady gave a very powerful testimony where she had been married for 5 years, and her husband had been pimping her out for 5 years. And it took her a while to realize that she was being human trafficked. And it was only after she got pregnant and had a child, and that little girl was 3 or 4 years old, and she started thinking, "Oh my God, he's going to do it to her. He's creating an industry here with me and now my daughter." And she was able to have somebody help her escape that horrible scenario that she was in. But you're absolutely right. There's a percentage of those missing children that are a red flag to law enforcement.
I can also tell you that now that you mentioned that, I can also tell you that in these cases, it's probably the most underreported crime. That and sex crimes, sexual batteries are the most underreported crimes because the victims just don't identify as victims. They don't think that they're victims. They oftentimes blame themselves for the situation that they're in, and they don't see themselves as victims. So it's incumbent upon us in law enforcement, in the legislature, in the community as a whole. It's incumbent upon us to help them realize that they are being victimized.
Any words of advice for our colleagues that are still on the job that may need a little bit of help, maybe a little doubt? I know that training, we often try to get to as much training as possible, but it just doesn't come around enough, right? Any words of wisdom or any words of advice that you can give our colleagues that are still out there on the job?
Well, I will tell you, and I will tell you that as of about 2 to 3 years ago, the legislature has enacted a lot of legislation here in Florida as far as education and as far as healthcare providers receiving education on human trafficking, the school system receiving education on human trafficking. So those are all, I think, great beginnings. Now, unfortunately, it's only an hour of training that they're mandating, and an hour, in my opinion, is just not enough time. I will tell you what I told the service provider that asked me the question about obstacles on Friday. I told him, I said, some of our biggest obstacles, I think, is awareness and is training, not just of the public and not just making the public more aware, but of law enforcement officers. I still have law enforcement officers that come up to me and don't understand what human trafficking is. And so if they don't understand it, they're not seeing the red flags. I know that for about 6 or 7 years now, at least, they've mandated that in the academy, the officers get a 4-hour block on human trafficking, which is huge because before that, they weren't getting anything. So we did back in 2012, 2013, we did a train the trainer here in South Florida, where we developed a training program for all the different municipalities in South Florida to go back and train their officers, their patrol officers, to see some of these signs and some of these cues. And hopefully that's helped, because I think that really is one of our biggest obstacles is awareness and training.
And where can they go if any of our law enforcement is still on job, or any citizen that wants to get more information or at least hone in their skill sets here? Are there any sites that they can visit?
Sure, there's a ton of information online. One of the sites that I really, really like to get information off of is Shared Hope. Shared Hope is a great site. A lot of good information on there, a lot of good statistics. They offer Also videos that you can purchase to show your kids. I've purchased a couple of them that I use when I'm teaching awareness at, churches, youth groups, schools when I was working. So there's a lot of good information on Shared Hope. Polaris is another one that provides a lot of good information. And there's a lot of stuff out there, but I would say those two are probably a great start. NCMEC also has a lot of good information. So all of those are good sources of information, good sources of reliable information that you can go on there and get just a ton of information. But Shared Hope, I would say, is probably one of my favorites because they just offer a wide variety of information on the topic.
Tom, before we came on with a little offline conversation, I know we talked about depending on where you go to get your stats. I know I went on and it showed that Florida was the third leading state in reporting human trafficking cases. Miami's the fourth largest city in reporting human trafficking. And again, they may not be accurate in fourth, fifth, but you did say that Florida tends to be in the top 5 usually, give or take. And for those of you that missed it, the human trafficking hotline, national hotline number is 1-888-373-7888. That's 1-888-373-7888. If you know of anyone that may potentially be, if you want to report a human trafficking case. But my question to you, Tom, is with your vast knowledge and experience, if you were to be speaking to someone that is a potential victim, but they haven't acknowledged that they may be a victim, and they have these doubts on their relationship, their circumstances, what would you say to someone to maybe seek help? That they, if you were able to speak to a wider range of individuals out there, there's some victims in the crowd, what would you say to try to pluck them out and have them seek help?
I would tell them something that you mentioned earlier when you were talking about that lady that was trafficked by her husband for 5 years and didn't realize it until she had a child. This is something that I used to tell victims all the time. I would ask them, do you have a younger sibling? Do you have sometimes a child? Would you want that person to go through what you've been through? And a lot of times it gets the wheels turning and it gets them thinking about, no, I wouldn't want them to go through that. I wouldn't want my younger brother or sister to go through that. I wouldn't want my child to go through that. So I think sometimes we just need to help a little bit and let them know that, hey, what you've been through is horrific. But in order to prevent somebody that you love or care for from going through the same thing, you need to report it so that it doesn't happen to one of your loved ones or a friend or another family member.
Yeah, there are certain things that just don't pass the smell test, if you want to say it that way. Because this person that I mentioned earlier, she, you think of domestic violence, she wasn't being battered, she wasn't being physically abused in the sense that she had bruises on her and whatnot. Her debts were paid. She had food. She was able to get in her car and travel and go around the neighborhood and go do her groceries and whatnot. But there was this dysfunctional circumstance where her husband was exploiting her. And again, some people may not understand, may not be able to decipher what's really going on. And, when in doubt, I tell, pick up the phone, let somebody else figure it out. Call that 1-800 number, call somebody, tell somebody. And if you have more than 2 people telling you, man, that doesn't seem right, you may want to seek help.
Yeah, and what people need to realize too is there's more types of trauma than just physical trauma.
Correct.
There's emotional trauma, there's trauma bonds that you can't see, that keep these victims in place. And people need to realize that, because I think a lot of times we overlook that. And especially even us in law enforcement, I think a lot of times we don't see that. And so we don't see it, so we don't acknowledge it, but it's definitely there and it's real. And these people are suffering trauma on a daily basis, usually.
Yeah, and I suspect that the use of the internet, certainly, our kids come home, they go right to the computer because they're doing their homework or what have you, get sidetracked with the pop-ups or just curiosity.
An interesting statistic that I showed earlier in my class is that teenagers and children consume about 51,000 hours of media.
Wow.
And that was
In what time period?
well, that in I think it's a year. Okay, but that was back from 2017 or 2018 with everybody being sheltered last year because of COVID. I would imagine that that number has to have doubled or tripled.
A lot of what we've been talking about here reminds me of somewhat of what goes on in elderly abuse, and it just so happens June is also elderly abuse awareness month, and a lot of the individuals that are abused, the elderly, are being abused by their caretaker. They don't report it. They don't report it. There's a shame. There is a certain level of this will go away, and it doesn't. And it doesn't. So again, I want to give that number for the human trafficking hotline out is 1-888-373-7888, 1-888-373-7888. Pick up the phone. They have professionals on the other line. I think that's Polaris, right? They can answer a lot of questions.
So those media facts that I was telling you, it says the average American child aged 6 through 18 spends 2,000 hours with his or her parents, 11,000 hours in school, and 51,000 hours consuming media.
Wow.
And $17 billion are spent in advertising directed to children.
And the likelihood is unsupervised media.
Correct. Those are insane numbers. And if you think about the fact of how many people and how much time we all spent indoors last year, I'm telling you that number easily doubled, maybe tripled.
That is just incredible when you begin to wrap your head around that. Just the thought alone, man. 2,000 hours with the parents and 51,000 compared to 51,000 hours on the internet, unsupervised most of them.
Tom, can you give those numbers again? Because one of those numbers really popped out. How much time in school?
11,000 hours in school and 2,000 hours with parents. Okay,
so you got 11,000 hours in schools, and I know parents wanted schools open so they can have their kids go back to school. And school's a big deal. It really is. And everyone should go out and get an education. And I am a strong supporter of higher education.
Right.
And how many in media in front of the exposure?
51,000, but that was before COVID. These numbers are pre-COVID.
So think about it. You can so 1 year's 11,000 education. You're spending the equivalent of 5 years of education in front of social media or media of some sort, 5 years in a 1 year's period of time.
Yeah.
That's crazy.
What are the areas that we should be pushing for with the legislature, at least the upcoming legislature, when it comes to this topic?
One of the biggest things that we've been pushing for a long time, and when I was detached to the state attorney's office for a year, I know that they push for this all the time, but I believe that we're one of only, in Florida here, we're only one of, I think it was 7 states that allows depositions of sexual assault victims. Did you know that?
No.
So in
one of 7 states that allows deposition of sexual assault victims. Did I say that right?
Yeah. In most other states, sexual assault victims are not allowed to be deposed because of the fact that it causes repeat trauma on the victims to have to be deposed and tell their story over and over and over again. And it causes repeat trauma, but we're one of a very few handful of states that still allows that. And that's legislation that I know that Ms. Rundle's office fights for that all the time. But I think that would be an important legislation because a lot of times you can't even get victims to come forward because of that fact, because of the fact that they don't want to go through that and they don't want to put themselves through that and re-traumatize themselves. But that's something that we've been fighting for a long time. And I think it's probably important legislation. Look, we've come a long way. I tell people this all the time. Since 2007, when I first started working these cases, we've come a really, really long way. And the laws have changed a lot. And there's been new laws enacted. Just recently, just 2 years ago, we enacted the laws about the tattoos and the branding that now makes that a felony. That's a huge, huge law. That was a huge win for us in law enforcement. And it's a huge win for these victims because that makes that now a very, very serious crime. So every year it seems like we get a little bit more legislation. And I think, like I said, we've come a long way in 13, 14 years since I was working these cases, since I started working these cases. But I think we still have such a long way to go.
Tom, I'm going to use that as a segue to say you're on Miami Cop Talk, listening to Miami Cop Talk. Visit us at MiamiCopTalk.com, YouTube, Instagram, Twitter, and go to our website, MiamiCopTalk.com, and support us, share the content. As we get ready to close off, is there any message, anything you would like to say to our listeners, to those in law enforcement and not, about this very, very serious topic of human trafficking?
Just keep fighting and keep the awareness going, and keep calling in, like you said. If you see something that doesn't meet the smell test, please call one of those numbers that we've provided.
You have been listening to Miami Cop Talk. We hope you have enjoyed this episode, and visit us at MiamiCopTalk.com to get the latest on all our broadcasts. We want to thank our partners and sponsors that have made Miami Cop Talk possible. And on behalf of Robert Asencio and Raul Correa, we want to thank you for listening to Miami Cop Talk. Stay connected and visit us at MiamiCopTalk.com.